Hello, hello. Today I just want to talk about more shader stuff and just, I guess, maybe the mindset of trying to construct your own shaders. So, there are so many ways of going about this, and it's hard to find information on what's wrong, what's right. Am I doing it correctly? Am I doing mistakes? Am I gonna dig myself an early grave when I do this stuff? And let me assure you, there's really no wrong or right answers to this. It's basically the aesthetics of the individual. So, if I just open up a shader editor here, just to show you, this is the default cube, and this is what we usually get. And there are a lot of parameters here with different nodes. Usually, gray here dictates the numerical values, yellow is for color, purple is for vector, and actually, I do have a different theme on, so it may not look like this. I might just revert back just to show you. Or you can change your theme this way. I like using Blender or Minimal Dark because I find when I do Blender Dark, this might be easier to read at the glance, but I really like Minimal Dark. Just keep everything simple that way. It makes me learn what each of these functions do. Anyway, so we have base color, numerical values. This takes in vectors. Same here, vectors and vectors. And let's just go back to shader view like this. We can manipulate the shape, the lighting via normals. And that's what normals are. So if I just, say, let me open up a texture coordinate. And you can see here, these are just the normal informations. So if I disconnect this and just use this, generated. What generated is, what you're seeing here is just how the lighting is going to be manipulated on. And these are just the coordinates or the faces of where the lighting is. If we go to normal, this is what we are used to seeing. So like, since this is flat, blue is going to be up, and you can see the respective things. It actually matches this space here. And I think if we create a beveled edge like this, you can see that it kind of mixes the color because it's mixing these two things together. So that's another way to kind of like manipulate the lighting. So what happens if we actually blended these two together, not with an edge, but rather with a color? It will kind of like try and blend the colors this way, and it'll look kind of odd from certain angles, but if you're looking from up top, it looks like this little wrap there. Anyway, let's continue on. UV, this is just the UV space. Again, we can manipulate the textures. This is how we can kind of like disperse textures by using the UV. Now just to show you like a quick example of what I mean by that. So this is a checkered box, and it needs to be fed in a vector, which is one of these things here. So if I go back to UV, let me just do this, and if I pop it up here, it's just going to match the UVs. Granted, the UVs are up here, and I'm kind of going all over the place right now, but this is just an overview, not really a tutorial. And so this is how the UVs are mapped here. We can always change this kind of stuff. So if I go to Smart UV Unwrap, you can see it's changed to this, and the box is slightly changed. And now if we plug this back in here, you can see it's mapped to what this is. So it's like all the squares are like that. And now, let's say if like, I actually want a different texture, but for whatever reason, we can alter what this normal map is doing here, or sorry, this normal vector to vector. And there's a number of ways to do this. We can use a vector math. If we plug this in here, and look what happens when we move this, we're kind of like shifting the UVs around. Now what's happening here? Well, let's plug this into the viewer and see. You can see nothing's, there you go. So now you can see it's manipulating this a lot. And now this is what people tend to do if they want to have more seamless textures. They'll plug in some noise, they'll plug in some Voronoi, and that's how you can kind of like get rid of the seamless textures a little bit. So let's plug that UV back in here, and let's use a noise texture. So plop a noise here, and what can we do? We can actually just also, let's see what happens. Vector math. We're adding it, and let's see what happens when we do this. You can see it's started to warp it because it's our noise texture. You can see this is our noise texture here. I think I plugged in color, but if we plugged in factor, we plug this here, you can see it's really changing it up. Now what happens when I move the scale down? See, we're getting back to our square here, or a checkered texture. If I put generated on just to show you more, now look what happens. Oh, we're getting some really amazing funky distortion. We lower this, we can also increase the distortion here. You can see that's all dispersed that way. Now the same thing goes for this. Since this shader is living within here, we can actually plug in the UV, and so it's going to be mapped to the UV, which is like the squares here. And so what that would look like is, you can see here, each of these, you see there's an edge right here, because it's mapped to the UV. You can see it's not really seamless. And now this can work to an advantage sometimes. You can see it's whirly texture. And we'll just use this. We can change the scale of this, and yeah, so that's one fascinating way of manipulating your normals. We can get really complicated too, that way. Creating more crazy experimental shaders. What else do we have here? Let's see. Well, again, I talked about color. You can plug anything into this base color. So what can we do with this? Well, you can actually create a whole color network that just plugs directly into the base color. So I plug that in here. Nothing really happens. As you can see, there's no gradient. It's only taking like the mid value, or I guess it's taking the average sum. So what happens if we do want a gradient in here? Well, we kind of need to create a whole network of gradient stuff. So we can either create a gradient texture and plug that in. So if I just show you quickly, now we have a gradient, because it's mapped to this gradient, but we don't really have control. But if I showed you here, there's a vector, which means we can plug in mapping stuff. We can do that with Control T, which is a Node Wrangler shortcut. And you can see that the texture coordinate, which is just basically how the texture is mapped on the object, is going into mapping. And now we have all these parameters to play around with. We can also just switch this type to texture, which I think changes the way the rotation works. I could be wrong. But now we can use this to our advantage, where, you know, if you're like, oh, I really don't like how the darkest color is here, you can change the rotation. You can see you can move around, so we can go 90, and negative 90 is the inverse of that, so there we go. That's great. And what I also like to do is, like, since this is an actual shader with all these properties and takes in light, you can just plug this directly into the surface, and we can see what the gradient is doing by itself. So that's our simple gradient network. But there's more to this. Remember what I talked about, how we could plug things in here from texture coordinate to mapping? We can also do the same from mapping to gradient texture. All of these are possible. So we can add, let's say, I'm just going to add maybe a checker texture just to show you. And what happens if we plug these? So we have another vector here. We plug, I don't know, let's try a vector math. Okay, so we're adding whatever this is, information, to here. You can see nothing's really changing except for the Z or Z value. What happens if we plug this in? Oh, look at that. So what's the look of this? So it looks like the texture or the light information is being masked out in certain areas. So we plug this back in here. You can see it's being masked out here. That's where the white is. So we can change that. And what happens if we go darker? Lighter, darker. Same thing here. Darker, lighter. So this is the value that is showing the gradient. We're masking it partially out. But we can also create another network here if we want to manipulate this. We can also use these things here to further change this. So let's say, for example, we use the window into a vector, and now it's kind of like a reflection based thing. So now it's always going to be facing us. But if we wanted to contort and warp around the object itself, we can use reflection. And now you can see we're getting really funky, interesting looks. And now what happens if we add, let's say, a cube in front, just to kind of like ground it a bit? Because sometimes it might be a little too much for viewers to understand where this is in relation to a space. So if we have some like grounded objects around, we can kind of tame the craziness that this shader is creating. Like even the way I move, it's kind of wild. But now, as you can see here, if I do this, we can kind of slowly understand where it is in relation to a space. It's almost like a weird little portal here. Alright, that's kind of neat. And we're just using simple setups. It just takes a while to break the constraints here, because sometimes when I first started, I was afraid of like plugging things in. I was like, oh man, do I need to be like a math genius? Honestly, no, not really. You just put a lot of experimentation. What else can we do here? Well, what happens if we put normal here? Well, looks like nothing's changed, because that's just based on the normal of this. You can see here. If I scale this up a bit, see, nothing's really changing. How if I do the UV instead? Oh, let's see, now that's changed a bit, because that's how our UV's mapped. So if we plug this back in, you can see it's acting a little bit nicer now. Okay. So I kind of like the weirdness of this reflection. And you can see we can scale this up. And you can also animate this kind of stuff too. We can key anything here, anything to your heart's content, we can key it. So let's say we grab this and we key it. So you can key it by right-clicking and insert keyframe, or you can just hover above it and hit I. But you might note that we don't see anything here. We actually have to click this. And let's say, bring it over here, like that, hit I. And now, as you can see, as it turns, we've created a really wild looking shader. Click on this, we can do linear, so it doesn't have like ease in, ease out. If you just want something doing this. That's crazy. We can change the color too, kind of like that's what's needed here, but I don't think anything changes too much slightly. We probably have to change it on this end here. You can see what's happening that way. What else can we do? We can feed this into, so we have color here, we can feed this into a mix RGB, and we don't need to feed that. We'll feed this into the factor, which is a mask. So now we're masking two colors. We can change this to anything we want now, as you can see. And the cool thing is we can actually keyframe these as well. So let's go here, insert keyframe red, and maybe as the time goes on, it'll reach over here, insert keyframe. As you can see, that's what's happening. Let's try the same thing here. So it starts off blue, and let's just go to the other side, and let's try that. Insert keyframe. Now look at that. And that's just, hopefully this isn't getting too confusing. I know I'm rushing a lot, but I just wanted to show you like the things you're able to do. And like all you have to do is just plug things in and out. And if you think it may not happen, you should just try it anyway, because you might find some new technique or some new way that you never thought possible. And then it starts building up those like neural pathways of like, oh, what happens if I plug this in instead? Or maybe I should plug this in. Sure, there might be like a huge initial fear of trying to get good at something, or you start absorbing a lot of tutorials to try and get a specific thing. But I think the great thing is once you understand how, you can use each of these tiny components, and that you have the freedom to manipulate any of these things, you're going to start having a lot more fun. It's a giant sandbox. And you can play around, yeah, like play around with anything here. I might leave it off here soon, but let me think what else I could show you quickly. A good thing too is if you want stuff to be a bit more modular, you can enable groups. And how groups are, if you select everything like this and Control G, it places it into a little node here. And what this node is now your own custom node within this specific scene file. So we can name this to anything we want. Let's just say portal. Kind of reminds me of a little portal, and call this portal. And you see here the node group, let's call this portal. This is everything portal for now. So if I click on this, let's say here, on this object, we can actually access this, or hit a new one, and let's say, oh, I want to add portal. So Shift A, search, you can see here, portal. And if you plug this into the base color, it should now look like this. Now the reason for why it's not changing like this, it's because this is keyed to this instance, this object. So we'll have to do the same thing here, where we key everything, I think, which is, oh, I don't know why it's not working. I may be wrong. Let's see here. Oh, that's interesting. See, I learned something new. I don't know why it's not changing. Well, you learn something new every day. Yeah, so, yeah, hopefully you learned something. Thank you.